A very warm welcome, everyone. Myself, Manish Prabhakar Singh, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Model College, Kharsawa, affiliated to Kolhan University, Chaibasa. Today's lecture is on the history of medieval English literature. The period of medieval English literature starts after the Battle of Hastings, that is, from 1066, and covers the period till 1485, that is, with the accession of Henry VII of Tudor dynasty. If you look at the timeline, the Norman conquest of England in 1066 provides one of those convenient landmarks for the historians. The Norman conquest imposed a French speaking ruling class on England. Many important events happened during this period, which helped in shaping the society and the literary period of that time. If you follow the timeline, look at the events like the Hundred Years' War or the Peasants' Uprising in 1381, Lollardism in 1381, or the Black Death, which reoccurred in 1362, 1367, and 1370. It was also the time of Holy Crusades, as could be seen from the literary work which talks about the knights. The Statute of Pleading in 1362 was an important landmark as it brought a decline in French as an important language. English replaced French as the language of courts. One should remember that after the invasion, French had become an important language, or to say, language of the upper class. But with the progress of time and with Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which was written in English, it brought forward English as a national language. If you look at the historical aspect of medieval period, with the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, defeated Harold, King of England. It signified the domination of French in English letters for almost 200 years. William I also introduced into England the system of feudalism. It was a hierarchy based on the latest powerful swearing allegiance. It began with the serfs and ended with the king and the pope. Under feudalism, the land is the property of the king, not of the tribe. He kept huge areas for himself but made grant of lands for his nobles. Just look at the given image and you can notice the king and the pope at the top. Roman Catholic Church at that time had become a powerful institution, but moving forward we see that the relationship between the crown and the church had become complex. The three states during that time were the clergy, nobles, and the commoners. If you look at the given chart, you can see that the Latin was a language of clergy, French had become the language spoken by the nobles, and English became the language of the commoners. This idea of state or orders was encouraged during this age. Moving further in history, you will find that there was decline in the structure of feudalism. We've already talked about the feudal system, which reached its height between the 8th century up to 12th century, and it disappeared in the beginning of the 15th century. At that time, the society was dominated by two great institutions, that is, feudalism and religion. We can say that the literature of this period can be grouped among these two institutions. Therefore, Latin became the language of the church and of scholars. You should know that the church controlled education, and we also see Oxford and Cambridge universities being established during this period. In the same way, French became the language, or we can say the official language of England and the language of aristocracy. It wasn't until the 14th century that English again emerged as a liberal and political language. It was due to the war with France that English began to take a nationalistic pride in their country and their culture. We see that many dialects in English, such as the rise of West Saxon and East Midland dialect. William Caxton used East Midland dialect for printing. The Statute of Plating in 1362 played an important role in giving English a look of an official language. Medieval literature saw quite a change for Anglo-Saxon literature. The characteristics of medieval literature includes chivalry, romance, courtly love, as well as the songs and ballads. The songs and ballads are of extreme importance as it showcases revival of alliterative tradition. Chivalry refers to the lifestyle and moral code of medieval knights. It includes benevolence, brotherly love, and politeness. The medieval knight was bound to the chivalry code to be loyal to God, his lord, and his lady. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the finest examples of literature relating to chivalry. Romance is a literary genre popular in the Middle Ages. Romances are narrative fictions representing the adventures and values of the aristocracy. Characters nearly always are or revealed to be knights, ladies, kings, queens, and other assorted nobles. It is not necessarily a story of love as generally thought of. The contemporary meaning of romance as a tale of love came only in the 19th century. The stories were first told in verse, but when later prose versions were made, they were also called romances. Courtly love was modeled on the feudal relationship between a knight and his liege lord. The knight serves his courtly lady with the same obedience and loyalty which he owes to his liege lord. She is in complete control and he owes her obedience and submission. The knight's love for the lady inspires him to do great deeds in order to be worthy of her true love, to win her favor. It was not such a simple love as between husband and wife, because it was, we can say, an idealized sort of relationship that could not exist within the context of real life and medieval marriages. We also see a tradition of songs and ballads which had a great effect on English writing centuries later, especially the ballads. The ballads, which are originally an orally transmitted narrative poems dealing either with themes common to folk song or with themes derived from the romances or with popular class heroes. The songs and ballads had a local tradition. As it had an oral tradition, it became difficult to date. They were all songs celebrating the changing of the seasons. Just look at the given images which depicts the chivalric romances as well as the courtly love. Medieval literature now can be divided into three phases, that is 12th century, 13th and 14th. The 12th century saw a beginning of the change. There was a change in heroic to romantic poetry. We also find that there was a relative period of stability in England. You will also notice the influence of French literature during that time. We find historical works like the History of the King of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. It contained accounts of Gorboduc, King Lear, and Cymbeline, which provided materials for various writers, including William Shakespeare. He gives us a picture of the Anglo-Saxons invasions through the eyes of the retreating Britons, and most importantly, we get the story of the exploits of King Arthur. It was translated into Middle English by Layman, which is known as Lyman's Birth, which was the first truly English version of the story of Arthur, signifying a nationalistic trend. Weiss's Roman de Brut is more than a simple translation of Geoffrey of Monmouth. It also includes Arthurian stories from other sources and is the first to actually mention the Round Table. You should keep in mind that when Weiss is talking about the Round Table, it means that the readers at that time were knowing about the stories regarding the Round Table. So for us, it could not be such a common thing, But for the readers of that time, it was a story which was known to all of them. William Nerval was another historian who wrote History of English Affairs. During this period, we also find homilies, which are the commentaries that follow the reading of the scriptures. We have Ormelum, written probably around 1200 by an Augustine canon named Orm or Ormin. The 400-line poema Moral is also a late 12th century versified sermons written in the same manner and same meter as the Ormelum. You also find the increasing influence of French models in English, or we can say Middle English works, as many of them were itself a translation from the French. The Roman de la Rose is one such prime example which had a major influence on English literature. The octosyllabic couplet, which English learned from French, which were used in varieties of work apart from the romances. During the 13th century, we find major French influence in the fables, allegorical fable, beast tale, as well as secular lyric. You will also find exemplum, which are tales in verse about miracles. All these literary forms are clearly visible in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The Owl and the Nightingale, a work allegorical in nature, is one of the first examples in English of the debate. The two words stand allegorically for the two ways of life, the monastic and the secular, or for two kinds of poetry, the didactic and the amorous. You will also find that during this period, there were a lot of individual successful poems, but no great English poet. We find the 13th century work retain elements of the Anglo-Saxon heroic tradition. Moving on, the 14th century was a challenging period, as this period saw many events which were to leave a mark on the history of the 14th century. Black Death or the plague impacted the social life, as well as the Hundred Years' War with France led to heavy taxation. The increasing power of the church also paved the way for corruption, as there were immense wealth scandals in monasteries. All this led to the Peasant Rebellion in 1381, and England found itself facing many problems like famine, death, anarchy, tyranny, war, and heavy taxation. So, the overall atmosphere during the 14th century was of turmoil. You will see that people were facing a lot of problems. The monarch or the crown itself was facing problems. There were a lot of change in the rulers, as well as church was facing its own problem of corruption. During this period, English also found his major writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, which many historians consider as a real starting point of literature. He is also referred to as the morning star of the Renaissance. As David Digest writes, Geoffrey Chaucer marks the brilliant culmination of Middle English literature. He had the metrical craftsman to handle English with a subtlety and flexibility and a polish which made it at once the equal as literary language of French or Italian. He lived under three monarchs as he was born in 1340 during the reign of Edward III. Richard II succeeded in 1377, and with the revolution of 1399, Henry IV ascended the throne. And Chaucer, who would have been thinking of having a comfortable life, died in 1400. Being closely connected with the court, he was trained in the courtly life, the diplomatic life, and urban life affairs. With Chaucer, English language and English literature grew. As he was sent for diplomatic missions to the different parts of the world, his travels exposed him to many different cultures. His two diplomatic visits to Italy played an influential role on him, and it is also said that he could have met Petrarch and Boccaccio. After his death, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, which later became famous as Poets' Corner. S.C.L. Kittredge writes in Chaucer and his poetry, vastly fortunate it was that Chaucer was born high in the social scale, not to need holy orders as a means of escape from warping circumstances. Otherwise, a great poet would have been spoiled to make an indifferent person. We have already seen that 14th century was a period of great turmoil. And what C.L. Kittredge is trying to say is that if Chaucer would have been a commoner, England would have lost a great writer. Chaucer would not have been exposed to so much of different cultures, and the refinement which he brought along with his writings would have been lost forever. David Dyches talks about Chaucer's writing style and how he used the available resources with his own vividness and brought to life the psychological and social world of time, which turns out to be also the world of our own and of every other time. If we look at the work of Chaucer, it can be divided into three periods. The first period was the French period, which lasted up to 1372. We must remember that for Chaucer, French was a language as familiar as English, and he absorbed the courtly love tradition as represented by French poets of his own time. His literary career began under the influence of medieval French literature, which includes satire, romance, and fable. He was truly familiar with the Romance of the Rose, which he also translated, and which became the source of so much of 14th century poetry. The dream allegory used here had already become the standard method of entering the poem, which is found in many literary pieces of this time. Chaucer's first narrative poem, The Book of the Duchess, is a dream allegory written at the end of 1369. The second period was the Italian period, which covered the time span up to 1385. Chaucer had went on diplomatic missions to Italy and was influenced by Italian culture, which could be seen in his works such as The House of Fame. The House of Fame was clearly influenced by Dante's Divine Comedy and is one of the most important transitional poems in English. His next work, The Parliament of Fowls, is also a dream convention, but it is more influenced by Boccace. The Parliament of Fowls is a poem in celebration of Saint Valentine's Day using the convention of the dream allegory and the demands armor. Troilus and Cressida, written probably in the mid 1380s, showcases the genius of Chaucer as metrical technician, as storyteller, and as a student of human character. It is, in a sense, the first real novel in English. The third and the most important phase was the time span from 1386 till death of Chaucer, which is also called the English period of his life, as we find his greatest work, his magnum opus, the Canterbury Tales, an unfinished work drawing the various strands of his genius together. The Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's magnum opus, is an unfinished collection of sorry, an unfinished collection of 24 stories told by a group of pilgrims who were traveling to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. Chaucer has presented the work as a storytelling contest in which each pilgrim would narrate two stories while going and two while returning. The winner would be having a free meal at Tabard Inn, where all the pilgrims have gathered in the beginning. All the characters are introduced in the prologue, and there is a sense of medieval life represented by a range of characters from every class of England. One thing to note is that though the portrait characters are from different class, he neither portrayed the highest nor the lowest. A group of linked tales told by different people was not unknown in earlier medieval literature. But what makes Canterbury Tales unique is its individualizing of the narrators in the whole sense of the social contemporary scene. If you look at the way Chaucer presented his characters, there was a touch of irony and cynical humor. Only the knight, the poor parson, and the plowman are treated without any irony at all. The knight represents the highest form of chivalry and courtesy. The poor parson is represented as the true Christian, and he is contrasted with the other representatives of church. The plowman represents the hard working class, which would be difficult to find during that particular time, as it was the time of peasants' revolt and the statues of laborers. In a way, we can see that Chaucer presented the ideal figures, and all three particular figures are like anachronisms by Chaucer's time. During this period, there was an overall turmoil in English history as well as English politics. Chivalry at that time had become a kind of farce. The old order was breaking up, and church too was facing its own problem due to its corrupt policy. Chaucer, against such a background, presented the ideal figures of the knight, the parson, and the plowman. That is why Chaucer was not known as people's poet, but as a court poet, as his works do not reflect age's religious or social movement. It seems like he was quite removed from the realities of time. But to say that Chaucer did not present irony through its character would be a wrong assumption, as we find characters like the Pardoner, one of the greatest masterpieces of character drawing portraying the world of hypocrisy. As Dryden comments about the Chaucer's tales, here is God's plenty. The large canvas of Canterbury Tales later on goes to become the characteristic qualities of English literature. If you see the overall works of Chaucer, you will find though he was a courtly poet, but his works talks about the different stratas of society and how they formed or how they were behaving at that particular time. Though he does not talk about the kings and the popes or the lowest class of the people, but in his very ironical way, he exposes the minute mistakes of the society. But during that time, we also see Chaucer's contemporaries like William Langland, John Gower, and John Barber, who also played an important role. Langland's poem Piers Plowman is the first provincial work in English. It is an allegorical poem written in old alliterative verse. The work is concerned with the religious, social, and economic problem of the time. The work presents the poet's concern about the social and moral condition of England. John Gower, another of Chaucer's contemporary, wrote in French, Speculum Meditantis, Vox Clementis in Italian, and at last, Confessio Amentis in English. Towards the end of his career, he followed Chaucer's example. He is a typical representative of his age. Speculum Meditantis is a manual of sins and sinners and presents a detailed and gloomy account of the prevalence of vice springing from men's corrupt nature. Vox Clementis, written in Latin, is a dream allegory dealing with the peasants' revolt of 1381 and present a gloomy picture of violence and disorder along with the general corruption of the age. The Confessio Amantis, written in English, makes use of the structure of a Christian confession as a narrative frame within which a multitude of individual tales are told. Chaucer dedicated his Troilus and Cressida to Gower and correctly described Gower as moral Gower. John Barber was another of Chaucer's contemporary, belonging from Scotland, and is considered as the father of Scottish poetry. Bruce, written in 1375, is one of his famous works, which is a history of Scotland's struggle for freedom. If you look at the given image, you will see the manuscripts of Pier Plowman, Also a page from Confessio Amentis, as well as one of the famous lines from John Barber's Bruce. Moving on, you will see John Wycliffe, who was a very different figure from any members of the royal group. Wycliffe was a controversialist, philosopher, politician, and reformer. His followers, known as Lollards, a derogatory term used for them, not only attacked on some important claims and practices of the church. He started with the translation of Latin Bible into Vulgate, or we could say Vulgate Latin Bible into English, but the use of his English was very stiff. We also find Robin Hood ballads, which date from long after the period to which they are supposed to refer. Robin Hood is a human hero, the hero of a clan, but not a historical figure. With the challenging times, we find many different literary forms, and you can see a travel book of Sir John Mandeville, which is considered as the first English travel book. Handling Cinnabar by Robert Manning was the first confessional manual in English religious tendency. What makes this work unique is that it contained a lot of biographical information about the writers, which was not a very common theme at that time. If you can see that many writers during that time did not even sign their works, or it was considered a work which anybody can refer to. The writers like Wycliffe Hilton helped to keep a standard English prose style which kept it alive till the late 15th century when the increasing use of English prose in both secular and religious writing forged the development path of progress of English prose. With the alliterative revival, we find many verses not only in East Midland dialect but also from Northwestern dialect in a single manuscript which preserves the four poems Pearl, Purity, Patience, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. As there are many similarities, many historians consider it a work of one writer, and so a general term, Pearl poet or the Gawain poet, is used. Out of these four, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the most outstanding poems. It is a romance based on an ancient legend of Green Knight who challenges Arthur's knight. The charm of the poem lies in its medieval life, in the description of dress and armor, and in the details of the hunting scenes, making it one of the most subtle verses in English medieval literature. But medieval literature cannot be completed by just talking about literary works of the age or by never mentioning William Caxton. William Caxton had an important influence in English literature, who was an English printer, who was also a translator and a publisher. He established printing press in England in 1476 and he printed nearly all of the English literature available to him on his time. He printed the Canterbury Tales in 1478 and second edition in 1484. The dates are approximate and you will find in many history books the date from 1476 to 1485. You can look at the given image, which projects the first edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. William Caxton helped to break down the anarchy of dialects and to give England a standard language. To conclude, we can say that writers like Chaucer, from whom the English literature started, as a representative figure of that age. With Chaucer, the English language and English literature grew at a bound to full uh, or to get we can say to full complexity. But there was a huge gap between Chaucer and his successor as they lacked both his technical brilliance. The maturity which you can find in Chaucer's work were lacking in his successors, and we can say that Chaucer's tradition was later on followed by the writers during the time of Shakespeare. As Chaucer's successors lacked the technical brilliance and his breadth of vision, leaving him one of the most undisputed marker in medieval English literature. Between the 1470s and the middle of the following century, we notice a transition to early modern English, and with Caxton, English language moved further towards standardization. If you look at the language of Middle English at that time, you will find influence of French as well as Latin, and you will be surprised to know that French words, uh, where many French words you can find impacting the local vocabulary of English at that time. So, thank you for listening.